Thank you for attending the last session. If you haven't been enlightened, this is the last chance to be enlightened. I guess as a quick agenda for what I wanted to cover today, we have been working with industrial clients mostly for the last 10 years, and one of the, I think, management philosophies that everybody's heard is you can't manage what you don't measure. So the M&T, energy M&T systems have, I think this year really started to come into vogue at the Expo. I saw more software and metering solution companies or vendors than I've seen in the prior 5 years that come into this. But so we've also seen that with the industrial customers that we work with, and so I want to cover a couple of the key things that I think the success factors were in the programs that have been installed, and some anecdotes of success that have occurred after the installation of some of these systems. The end of it is really talking about how challenging it has been to sell the M&T package, or the idea of a monitoring and targeting energy system. There is a leap of faith involved in it. It's not a clean ROI, but the anecdotes and the stories I want to go through really are, I guess, highlighting how we went far and beyond what we thought we could do. And so, you heard a little introduction. I started my career 20 years ago now, and did a lot of pharmaceutical facility engineering work, central engineering work, cogen plants to chiller plant upgrades to all that kind of stuff. I left to go to grad school down here in Georgia Tech, and I ended up getting very actively involved in the Industrial Assessment Center program, and moved into kind of being the associate director for Georgia Tech for that for 2 or 3 years, and that really got me kind of excited about energy efficiency. So I left and went to what is today called Ecova. Back in those days it was Service Resources, then Pronova, now Ecova. You know, it keeps getting sold, but that was my first jump into an ESCO, and really what was exciting is at that time Enron collapsed, and all the work that Owens Corning was doing, just all of a sudden everybody's out of a job. So we were able to transition all that work into Ecova, or Service Resources at the time, and that led into me eventually actually just joining Owens Corning as their global energy leader. And we would do about $25 million a year in energy projects globally. There's 139 plants. That was an interesting, switching sides of the table, I guess, where I get to now work with every ESCO in every continent around the country, around the world. I couldn't move to Toledo, Ohio, though, so I had to find something else to do. I was married at the time, and my wife and her family live here in Atlanta, and it was kind of a choice. You either have a family or you go do this job up in Toledo. So I actually went to the airport, was a facility manager there for about 2 years, and you heard Kofi if you were at the opening session. This was about 7 years before he showed up, and I had left long before he came, but they're still working through trying to figure out how to do, I think, capital investment. That's kind of the problem, I think, with the association that's down there. It's always been difficult to get the funding to invest in the facility. So most of Kofi's story was all around low cost, no cost stuff, which is kind of the unfortunate headache that they're stuck in there with their ability to get capital. E3 Solutions is now 10 years old. It's an ESCO. We focus mostly on industrial, as I said, and it's really an engineering-centric group. We're not really working with customers that are all in one city. We're working with customers that have operations around the world. So the staff and team at E3 has grown to mostly just be engineers and project managers. The labor that does the project work is always sourced locally for us. We're doing more strategy and design and implementation. So let me move into M&T. That's my little background, I guess. Sorry for making that so long. Let's just start with, I think, really the building blocks of M&T is metering infrastructure, data telemetry, and then there's software. And everybody starts with the software, and it's the smallest part of the budget. It's important, it has to look nice, but the money really is spent trying to get the metering infrastructure put in place. And there's just all kinds of systems that are out there, so it's almost, you have to kind of say, well, what are the objectives? What am I trying to get to? And then let's see if I can find a software that fits. So I have no, I guess, no allegiance to any software provider, but I think what we found is that the features that are important tend to fall in these bottom 4 bullet points. there's a value to trying to get to doing better energy accounting, and we've kind of used the term user pays. In a production environment, there's just so many other variables that are of concern to production operations management. Energy may or may not even be on the radar screen. It's a matter of what the percentage of cost of goods sold are in energy, and if it's significant, we're still probably just talking 10–15% of the cost of goods sold, depending on the industry and all that. So getting operations to care has always been a challenge, and we find that if you at least start billing them for their own usage, then it brings some level of the rope being pulled then instead of being pushed. The M&T systems also have been very successfully funded and used to anchor savings or to perform measurement and verification post-project, and to track efficiencies and KPIs into the future to kind of sustain where we're at. What we found, that I got a few stories on here in a moment, is it also helped unlock a lot of things that we would have never seen at these locations without the data. So we tend to believe that things are all working right, and then you start to see some of the trend data in some of these systems, and you go, well, it's not quite what we thought. And I think some of the programs can do a lot to share best practices. So this is a somewhat dated slide that a Groom Energy white paper put out, but I thought it was kind of a nice eyepiece to just show the software world as a mess of options. And there's probably 5 more for every one logo you see up there that's not represented up here. Some of these companies have changed names and don't exist anymore either. But so, point being, that software thing, I just have to park that aside for a moment. And I think we found that the way to really deal with this is to say, let's talk about the real cost of this. How deep are we going to go with metering? And I think if you compartmentalize that around different levels of value, you'll start with, well, I can just take the site and get my site data. I'd love to then get down to a department level, and department could be, your entire utilities department versus production department A, B, C, whatever. That pushes that user pay model and gets us into doing some departmental intensity tracking. And then I think a level 3 is to go down even deeper into a line or a system, so a compressed air system or a chiller plant, and then we can ultimately get down to the asset level. And so this is kind of a silly slide, but we really moved into, I think, saying it's not just about electric. What is the compressed air cost that a department is consuming? And let's put that tariff into the M&T system, and let's just make that part of their accounting. And so here's an example of this is some type of a pharmaceutical supplies plant. They have a dialysis department, so I think I know where this one is. You did the job. This breakdown is then really just showing you that now we know who's consuming each utility and by what. And I know some of the stuff is hard to see up here, but I think there's chill water and compressed air and electric usage. And so the site has moved this into not just, okay, now that we know who's using what, now it's into their budget. A brewery company that we've worked with kind of did the same thing, and this leveling has kind of built up into, well, we've got to start by really trying to get to this level 2 so that they could do their user pay cost accounting. But within each group then, it kind of led to a stacking of how deep they wanted to go. So the utilities guys obviously wanted to start looking at systems, and the brewing department, they wanted to start moving into the different process areas and ultimately into the assets. This has then led to, well, if we go deeper, what is it that we're going to track and do? And so it's kind of turned into, and this is still what the brewery guys, let's just talk about the major energy consuming systems or process areas, and let's talk about the data that if we could start tracking, what would we be looking at? What would be our short interval control metrics that we're going to watch for? And so that's led to, somewhat of a playbook for the organization to go through and say, well, do we have this data, or are we tracking it today? If not, then that leads into the scoping, with the objective being really to try to track these KPIs. So let's get into some examples. There's some stories here really more about post putting in an M&T system. So let me start with a little 2 megawatt trigen plant that was built in 2010. O&M was taken in-house after about, I think the first 2 years or 3 years of operations. It was just more of a contract renewal decision. They decided to hire the employees. Unfortunately, as that happened and through the few years that followed, the employees knew how to keep the cogen plant running, but they were just laser focused on this graphic, this system, and they really weren't connected to the rest of the facilities team. They were always an independent contractor, and they were still kind of just left on an island. Well, this system was putting baseload 50-pound steam into the building. It's putting all the reheat hot water that it can produce off the jacket hot water system into the reheat loop to offload steam being used. And there was steam being topped up by boilers on top of what the cogen brought. And of course, they're taking their electric. Well, when we came through the site, we said, you know, there are performance issues, but why don't we start with putting an M&T system on top of this, and let's get the KPIs to make sure we know how to run this system. So there's an overall efficiency that cycle should have provided, and these are some of the charts and graphics that were assembled to track the operation, and really this kind of gets you to a point of saying, I don't necessarily need to watch these dashboards every single day. I just need to know when things fall out of whack. And I'd like to get an alert or an email when that happens, and then we got to dig into it. And so here's, you know, really kind of the last month or so. This system's at a point where it's coming up online and live just within the last 2 months. So we see we've got some overall efficiency drop, but we have 3 generation sources. Electric, we seem to be in the green, and we're hitting kind of the efficiency off of that, which is I would say, typical. But we do see that we're having some issues, and the dial on the right is more of an average over the window of the trend, okay? So we start to look at the hot water recovery, and we start looking at the steam, and we see there are some weird things happening, and there's a story behind every one of these, but I think a lot of this is just unseen and unaddressed. This case is there's a problem, something got fixed, but do we even know why the problem occurred? And I think through that conversation of looking at this data, there's a lot of organizational intelligence that's lifted. And there's communication now happening between operators and facility guys that just wasn't really there to even discuss this stuff. And I think, so this story goes into a boiler plant was being upgraded in its controls, and the contractor set a higher pressure off the boilers when he was done starting up the new controls. And that pressure was like, whatever it was, 70 pounds, and the steam generator off the cogen system was putting out 64. Well, when the HRT-SIG, the heat recovery steam generator, sees the pressure set point, it just dumps all the heat to atmosphere. So you kind of have to trick these things into just forcing all the heat you can out of the system. And one little change in a good project to put new boiler controls on suddenly caused all the steam to drop off. Well, I think somebody caught that, one of the boiler guys caught that, and he said, why are we running this higher pressure? We've never ran that. He fixes it, and all of a sudden it fixed. And I don't think that was really even known up through management. No one really even was aware until we really start looking at some of the data and asking the questions on what happened on that day, and then the guys start talking, and it was almost the boiler house guys don't even know that the cogen house is having any issues at all. They didn't know that there was a steam loss. They just knew they saw a new pressure they never saw before, so let's fix it. So that collaboration, I think, is enabled through what some of this data can do. And there's other examples in here. You see there's kind of a lower red limit for, this is the jacket hot water recovery off of this particular system. And we know it's in the bad yellow range, and heck, it's even saying that we're looking to get 50% of the available heat as our target to hit green on our dial. That's not really great, but that's the designed, capable, connected things that can take heat, can only get about 50% of what's available. And we start seeing all the drop off, and it's the same type of integrated system headaches, but separately managed, that has caused all the waste. So in this particular story is one of a steam valve leaking on a steam heater that has taken the hot water loop up over 200 degrees. The jacket hot water temperature coming off of the cogen system is only like 180 degrees. If the heat doesn't get used off of the cogen jacket, it goes to a radiator and it's just wasted the atmosphere. So in this case, the situation got so bad with this leaking steam valve that At nights and when loads are high, you don't really see the problem as much, but in warmer days, this hot water temperature would just rise so hot that it would push heat back into the jacket water loop and then just to the radiator. So now we've got kind of a boiler system heating up hot water and pushing it over to a cogen heat recovery system to just reject it to atmosphere. So through kind of seeing all this and fixing it, you kind of see things are starting to come up. But what was interesting about getting the conversation going through the data was just how the collaboration has improved within this particular site. So I know here's I'm giving you some graphic pictorials here. That whole cogen graphic is a whole separate system in a separate part of the campus from this particular place. And this is a heat recovery off the cogen hot water on the return to try to offload the steam. And so the leaking steam valves were just causing the temperature to kill the entire potential to recover any heat. With the M&T, though, I think you can take this to a point where now we start alarming for temperatures. You can start putting alarms on things like that. So I have another kind of opportunity found story in another location. This is on a chiller plant where effectively the understanding was that we have a master sequence control system. It's turning on chillers, it's turning off chillers. It does all that based on load, and great, we end up putting a chiller plant power meters, some tonnage meters, so you can get to a performance metric. And sure enough, you start watching and you say, no, I don't think this is working the way you think it is. Something odd is happening here. Well, every morning, a second chiller comes on whether it's needed or not, and every evening it turns off. What's going on? Well, come to find out, there was a day where somebody was just complaining about temperatures. So there's a chiller plant operator that he just makes it his routine. Every day he comes in, he turns the second chiller on, and every day when he leaves, he turns it off. So the controls were right, the behavior was wrong. And I don't think anyone knew he was doing it. He just felt that was the right thing to do to just keep the headaches to a minimum. And so the value in these cases too, by the way, we thought in just about every case of putting in M&T, you'd see somewhere in the 1 to 3% in savings, and just these issues that we're seeing after the fact are more than 3% of the spend in these sites, if left unaddressed, and a lot of them are. Another sequencing control story here, but there are multiple air compressors, same type of situation. There is controls to allow things to run, but there's always operators that'll just have an issue and they'll go and put something in hand. And so this was a case where a lot of air compressors were just left in hand and operating, and the controls weren't able to do anything to turn them down. Recognizing that was through the KPI of cubic feet per kilowatt hour from getting the compressed air plant at this location under an M&T system. So then the investigation from that's not a design performance that system should be doing had led to, it's a recommissioning of the controls, no capital, and the results of the program are then simple and easy to see, right? So and I guess a final example on some of the use of some of this information. Again, I'm not really trying to sell anybody software here. They all have different capability, but I think some of the capabilities kind of go with the particular company. If I talk to a high energy using company that has multiple departments, the idea of user paid by departments makes sense. There are some manufacturing facilities where there's no clear definition of a department, so that user pay piece maybe isn't as critical as just looking at KPIs or doing some tracking. And there's a few examples of taking this across multiple plants that I'm showing here at the bottom, where you start to compare peer groups against each other, and you kind of drive the interest and focus through competition or through embarrassment, right? So the difficulty has always been, how do you get money? And I mentioned there's some DOE white papers that the projects that we've worked on that has allowed M&T systems to get put in. There's studies that have suggested just having the metering capability and having these types of tools, you can reduce 1 to 3% of spend. And it's a total leap of faith to try to sell that. Whether you're internal, external, sell into a company, it doesn't matter. There's still a leap of faith that everybody has to take. And we've seen 3% more than that after the project. So I don't think there's as much resistance to taking that leap of faith today as there has been over the years. 10 years ago, I couldn't get past this point. It's like, well, maybe we just put meters into the project and use them to M&V the project, and as long as it doesn't kill the budget, or if it doesn't get value engineered out, which it usually would. So we found that most of the work to put the M&T systems in had to be part of an M&V plan. It's somewhat changing, and that whole software selection piece, I think you get into an opportunity if you're within a company that has a portfolio of operations and you see the bigger, broader play of trying to bring all those systems or all those plants under one system. There are definitely suboptimal software solutions for a particular plant, but if it's the corporate strategy, then it allows all the integration of all the data from multiple sites. You can kind of handle that argument with the local, I guess the local team or engineering folks that may want something different, because if what you want is a point solution, what the company wants is an enterprise solution, right? So I think where I've seen the most success on how these M&T systems have come together has been to find those areas that really we want to bring our metering to, so we can start setting some budgets. What's rational KPIs that we could benefit from tracking? What are the systems that we actually can influence and control? Do we have a corporate strategy to try to find a solution that we can continue to add plants to? And then how do we really fund it? Well, we're still taking a leap of faith there, but I know that some of the challenges that we've been asked to undertake with some of our clients have been, can we do a post M&T installation focused review of the data? It's really, I mean, the data's great, but if you're not going to analyze it and find stuff, you can't. We've made commitments to folks that if we can just get in and use this data and work on the systems to see how they all interrelate, now that we can see the information, we can guarantee we'll find 3%. So we've kind of moved our programs into really taking risk and saying, I don't know that you can necessarily always expect that the operators that are running your facilities really can use this type of data and have the engineering acumen to figure out how to find value with it. So it leaves a bit of a gap. You get the investment in and you want to find more value for it, but you may not always have the resources. So what E4E has switched into thinking and doing is that, well, we know they have good data. They have the ability to have a lot of analytics on their systems that are traditionally harder to do with just temporary data logging and that kind of thing. So let's use that information and drive value, and let's put some risk on the table to do so. So that's a bit of a story of some of the interesting